bound by the Mafia. A love born from danger. Elena stood in front of her grandfather's coffin, her hands trembling as she held a white rose. The funeral home was filled with people mourning his loss, but none of them felt the weight of it as heavily as she did. Her entire world had crumbled in a matter of days, leaving her lost, shattered, and utterly alone. Silent tears streamed down her face as she clenched the rose tightly, her nails digging into her palm in a desperate attempt to ground herself. He had been her rock, her protector, the one person who had always made her feel safe. And now, he was gone. A sob threatened to escape her lips, but she swallowed it back, forcing herself to remain composed. The ache in her chest was unbearable, an emptiness that no words could fill. She felt abandoned, adrift in a sea of grief, and the only anchor she had left had unknowingly handed her over to a monster who had torn apart what little piece she had left, leaving her broken and afraid. Now, as she stood there, grief and fear tangled within her. She could only wonder, had she truly lost everything? It had only been 2 weeks since her wedding. The first week had been a rude awakening. Matthew, her husband, the man who had once seemed so gentle, so perfect, had transformed overnight. The moment the wedding vows were spoken and the doors of their new home closed behind them, his true self had emerged. His words were sharp as daggers, slicing into her confidence with each insult. She had endured it for days before she could no longer bear the suffocating atmosphere. She ran to her grandfather, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded with him. "I can't do this, Grandpa. He's cruel. He isn't the man I or you thought he was." Her grandfather, a man of old values, had frowned but tried to console her. "Elena, marriage isn't easy. You have to work through your problems, not run from them. I'll speak to him." And he did. That evening, her grandfather called Matthew over and gave him a stern warning. "Elena is my granddaughter, my only family left. If you mistreat her, you'll have to answer to me," he had growled. Matthew had apologized, had smiled, and reassured them both that he would be better. But it was a lie. That night he had taken his anger out on Elena, not with fists, but with words that left deeper scars than any wound could. He knew exactly where to hit her without leaving a mark. He grabbed her wrist with just enough pressure to make her wince, whispered threats in her ear that made her blood run cold, and reminded her that she belonged to him. Elena had tried to be strong. She had tried to hold out hope that things would get better. But she had underestimated the depth of Matthew's cruelty. It only escalated. He became more violent, careful not to leave any evidence. When she flinched at his presence, he would chuckle darkly and whisper, "You're mine, Elena. There's nowhere for you to run." She had reached her breaking point the night he locked her in their bedroom, shoving her hard enough to make her stumble. He hadn't hit her. He never did where it would show. But the bruises on her ribs and arms spoke of his rage. That night, she escaped. She ran to her grandfather's house, barely able to breathe through her sobs. When he saw the fear in her eyes, the old man's face darkened. "That's it," he had said. "This marriage was a mistake." The next day, he had summoned Matthew, and this time, there were no words of reconciliation. There was only a warning reinforced with a message of physical consequence. Matthew had returned home that night with a bruised jaw and a temporary limp. He had glared at her, seething, but he hadn't said a word. Then, 2 days later, her grandfather was dead. They said it was natural causes, but Elena didn't believe it. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Her grandfather had been the only one who could protect her, the only one Matthew had feared. Now, as she stood at his funeral, lost in her grief and fear, she noticed a presence, a man she had never seen before, standing across the room, watching her with an intense gaze. His suit was impeccable, his posture rigid with authority. His eyes were dark, unreadable, yet familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. Then, he started toward her. Elena's heart pounded as he approached, calm, yet imposing, He stopped in front of her, extending a hand. "Ah, you must be my granddaughter." Her breath caught in her throat. You see, your grandfather never told you about me," the man interrupted smoothly. "So I'll introduce myself. I'm your great-uncle. Call me Don Salvatore." Mafia Don. The words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Elena stared at him, speechless. The air around him crackled with an undeniable power, one that demanded respect, one that made people listen, or else. She had known her grandfather had secrets. He had always been a strong, respected man, but he had never spoken of his past, never mentioned any siblings. And yet, here was this man, standing before her, claiming to be family. Salvatore studied her, then tilted his head slightly. "You look just like your mother." Elena swallowed hard. "You knew my mother?" A shadow passed over his expression. "She was my niece, and I loved her dearly. I was there when she was born. I would have been there for you too if your grandfather had allowed it." Tears burned at Elena's eyes. "Then why are you here now?" His lips curved slightly, but it was not a smile. It was something colder, sharper. "Because, Elena, I suspect your grandfather's death was not as natural as they claim, and I do not take kindly to those who harm my family." A shiver ran down her spine. "You think he was murdered?" His gaze flickered to the side, to Matthew, who stood near the entrance, watching their conversation with narrowed eyes. Then he turned back to Elena and said, "What do you think?" Elena's heart clenched. She had suspected it from the moment she heard the news, but hearing it from him made it feel real. If her grandfather had been murdered, there was only one person who had a motive. "Matthew." Elena clenched her fists. "I want the truth." Salvatore nodded approvingly. "Then, we shall find it." From that moment on, everything changed. Salvatore took her under his protection, and within days, information surfaced. A toxic substance had been found in her grandfather's bloodstream. Subtle, untraceable to the untrained eye, but damning enough. Matthew had been careful, but he hadn't been careful enough. Matthew had plans of his own. When he saw who had arrived at the funeral, he knew his scheme was becoming more difficult to execute. He had to act fast. Under the guise of stepping outside for air, he had already prepared his escape route. As the mourners wept inside, Matthew's men struck like shadows, swift and silent. Elena barely had time to scream before a cloth was pressed against her mouth, the sickly sweet scent of chloroform filling her lungs. Her world spun into darkness. When she woke, her wrists and ankles were bound, and she was in the back of a speeding black SUV. Her pulse pounded in terror as Matthew sat across from her, a twisted smirk on his lips. "You thought you could run from me, Elena," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You're mine, and no one, not even your precious Mafia uncle, can save you now." He pulled out his phone, dialing a number with an eerie calmness. "5 million, he demanded when the line connected. "If you want her alive, you'll pay up." Little did he know Don Salvatore's men were already on his trail. They had cracked the signal within minutes, tracking the SUV's every move. The chase was on, and Elena's captors were about to find out exactly why no one messed with the Mafia Don's family. They tracked him down swiftly, using every resource at their disposal. The rescue mission was precise, calculated, until Matthew, cornered and desperate, pulled a gun. In the chaos of the moment, a shot rang out. Before Elena could react, a strong body collided with hers, shoving her out of the way. She gasped as she hit the ground, staring in horror as one of Salvatore's men, a strikingly handsome man with piercing eyes, grimaced in pain. A bullet lodged in his shoulder. The room erupted into gunfire, and within seconds Matthew was subdued. The man immediately got up and carried Elena out princess style, cradling her gently before handing her over to another trusted ally. She hesitated, her fear evident as she clung to his shirt, traumatized. He cupped her face, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "You're safe now," he murmured reassuringly. "I need you to go with him to the hospital. I promise I'll be there as soon as possible." She searched his eyes for any sign of deceit, but all she found was unwavering determination and pain. With one final glance, he turned back, barking orders to his men to clean out the whole place, leaving only the bastard for the boss to deal with. Hours later, as Elena lay awake in the hospital room, her heart pounded when the door swung open. Her breath caught in her throat as the man who had saved her staggered inside. His face was pale, his body weakened from the blood loss he had ignored while ensuring her safety. He barely managed a weak smile before his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor. Elena cried out, rushing to his side as the medical staff scrambled to help. Later, when he finally regained consciousness, he found her asleep beside him, her fingers still clutching his hand. Even in her exhaustion, she had refused to leave his side, fearing he might slip away after everything he had done to protect her. When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open, Elena was there, watching him with relief and something deeper, something unspoken. He reached for her hand, his grip weak, but full of meaning. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Elena gave a small, trembling smile. "Of course I did. You saved me." He chuckled weakly, wincing at the pain. "I'd do it again." A silence stretched between them, charged with emotions neither of them had dared to acknowledge until now. Just as Elena leaned closer, the door burst open, and Don Salvatore strode in, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He paused, clearly surprised to find them in the same hospital room. However, his first priority was Elena. He approached her, his gaze scanning her wounds left by Matthew's brutality. "Elena, why are you up?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You should be resting." She looked at him, eyes filled with both gratitude and worry. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "After everything that happened, after he—" She swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. "I thought he was going to die. I couldn't leave him alone." Salvatore sighed, shaking his head. "You have a kind heart, Cara. But I need you to take care of yourself too." The interruption had momentarily broken the spell between her and the man who had saved her, but as Salvatore stepped back, Elena turned her gaze once more to the wounded man beside her, her heart aching with emotions she was only beginning to understand. Salvatore exhaled, folding his arms as he observed the two. "Elena, I suppose it's time for a proper introduction." His voice was firm but held an underlying warmth. "This man here is Francesco. He was once an orphan, but I took him in as my own. He became my best man, my most trusted soldier, my son. I would trust no one else with something as sensitive as your safety." Elena looked back at Francesco, her heart swelling with newfound appreciation. He wasn't just a protector. He was someone who had fought his way into a life that gave him purpose. And now, that purpose had led to her. Elena was discharged from the hospital first, but Francesco had to stay a few more days to recover. During those days, she found herself making excuses to visit him, feeling an undeniable pull toward the man who had risked everything for her. Their conversations grew longer, their silences more meaningful. One evening, as she sat beside his hospital bed, Francesco shared a part of himself he had never revealed before. "I grew up with nothing," he admitted, staring at the ceiling. "No family, no home. Salvatore found me in the streets, starving and alone. He raised me like a son, taught me everything I know, Loyalty, strength, and survival. But love? That was never part of the deal. Elena swallowed, reaching for his hand. And now? He turned his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. Now I don't know what I'd do if I lost you. Despite Salvatore's protests, she refused to leave his side for long. Each day she arrived at the hospital with fresh homemade meals, much to the amusement of the guards. Who would have thought? One of them chuckled as Elena adjusted the blanket over Francesco. The toughest man in the family getting pampered like a prince. Francesco shot them a warning glare, but it lacked its usual menace. Elena giggled at his frustration, placing a warm meal on his bedside table. You're just jealous, she teased, flashing the guards a playful smile. Damn right we are, another one added with a smirk. Where's our homemade food, Elena? Francesco groaned, shaking his head. Out, all of you. Laughter erupted as the guards left, leaving Elena alone with him. He sighed, leaning back against the pillows. They never let me live anything down. Elena sat beside him, placing a hand over his. That's because they care about you. And so do I. His amber eyes softened as he turned to face her. I know, Elena. And that's the only thing keeping me sane right now. Days later, when Francesco was finally discharged, he returned to Don Salvatore's grand estate, a sprawling mansion perched on the outskirts of the city. Elena had been waiting for him at the entrance, her heart skipping as he stepped out of the car. Welcome home, she said softly. He smirked, leaning on her for support as they walked inside. Home, huh? I think I like the sound of that. The mansion welcomed them both, its walls no longer feeling as intimidating to Elena as they once had. She spent her days adjusting to her new life, learning the intricate workings of the family business, not the illegal aspects, but the traditions, the responsibilities, and the protection it offered to those under Don Salvatore's rule. Francesco took it upon himself to teach her self-defense. Their training sessions were filled with laughter, teasing, and moments where their closeness became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, after she successfully dodged his attack, he caught her around the waist, pulling her flush against him. You learn fast, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. She smiled, resting a hand on his chest. I have a good teacher. It was nothing like the cold, rigid home she had shared with Matthew. Instead, the halls echoed with the warmth of family, filled with the voices of people who had become her new home. Elena settled into life at the mansion surprisingly fast. The staff treated her with respect, the guards greeted her warmly, and most importantly, Don Salvatore watched over her, as if she were his own daughter. But despite everything, she found herself drawn to Francesco's presence more than anything else. Their bond grew naturally. Late-night talks in the garden, stolen glances across the dining hall, quiet moments on the balcony overlooking the city. He was protective, but not possessive. Strong, but gentle with her. And, with every passing day, Elena realized she had fallen for him completely. One evening, as they stood beneath the soft glow of the garden lanterns, Francesco reached for her hand. The moment had been building between them for weeks, every stolen glance, every lingering touch leading them here. You deserve happiness, Elena, he murmured. Not fear, not pain, just happiness. She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. And what if my happiness is with you? Francesco's breath hitched. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek as his eyes searched hers for any hesitation. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his gaze. Not because he didn't want this, but because he wanted it too much. Could he really deserve her after everything they had been through? Elena saw the unspoken question in his eyes and smiled softly. You saved me, Francesco. But it's more than that. You make me feel safe in a way I never have before. His heart pounded. a rare vulnerability slipping past the hardened walls he had built over the years. He traced his thumb gently over her cheek, committing every detail of her face to memory. You deserve more than just safety, Elena. You deserve happiness, love, everything. Her breath hitched as she whispered, "Then give me that." Finding none of the hesitation he feared, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a slow, deep, long-awaited kiss, one that spoke of unspoken promises, of a love that had found its way through chaos and danger. The world around them faded, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them was running from their past. They had found home in each other. As they pulled away out of breath, he rested his forehead against hers, a small smirk playing on his lips. The guards are never going to let me live this down. Elena laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. Let them talk. This is our story. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she belonged.